Hello, this time on Sitrep, how do we ensure servicemen and women have confidence they won't be dragged through inquiries or court for doing their job properly, that they can trust the government has their back? We're asking that because 9 former top officers from Britain's armed forces have warned that deployed personnel are having to consider the lawyer behind as much as the enemy in front. The result, they say, damages operational effectiveness, and people are already leaving the services. So do we need new laws to protect our forces? Would pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights help them or reduce their own protections? Or do we simply need to better understand, explain and apply the law as it stands?
Our armed forces are extraordinary men and women who keep us safe, who go on difficult missions in dangerous and challenging places. We must defend those who defended us.
Defence Explained.
We must hold our armed forces to a higher standard than our adversaries because they are better than those adversaries. They must be expected to act within the law.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Balancing the need to uphold standards and the law to publicly acknowledge and punish wrongdoing if and when it happens, while also properly looking after people who have correctly done what was rightly asked of them by their country. That's a really difficult balancing act, isn't it, Mike?
Yes, it is at the best of times. And in general, Britain has got the reputation of dealing with these things. Remember, the International Criminal Court only comes into play when a government either is unwilling or unable to take its domestic law and apply it to armed conflict. And we always do. There's no question that we try to apply our domestic law in any cases that are important. But this works both backwards and forwards. It works backwards because we're talking still about things that happened in Northern Ireland in the 1970s, 50 years ago. But it also works forwards because there's a great deal of concern, and we've seen it recently among senior officers, that this is affecting the morale of troops going forward, that is forward in time, thinking about future operations. So it's not just a question of dealing with it carefully for things that have happened. It's a question of making sure that we retain the trust between troops and their commanders, the Ministry of Defence and the political elite, the political establishment. And that's quite a difficult balance to maintain at all times.
Lots to unpack today, Mike. You and I have used and discussed the term lawfare many times before on Sitrep. It's been used when we've talked about investigations into troops' actions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you say, we've heard it in the context of inquests and prosecutions surrounding events in Northern Ireland's troubles. And when politicians from all sides have promised to ensure protections for veterans and serving personnel, it does feel like an issue that really has emerged as a problem in the last decade or so, is it?
Well, it goes back quite a long way. I mean, it's a problem that comes to the fore whenever there are policing operations, counterinsurgency, counter-terrorism, because that's where the law of armed conflict is at its most ambiguous or most difficult to apply. I mean, it certainly can be applied, and it is applied, but it's always in a shifting situation. So the reason that we're constantly dogged by this issue is because we've had Northern Ireland, then counter-terrorism, then the operations in Iraq after 2003, and then operations in Afghanistan that ramped up after 2006. And so it goes on all the time. And it even goes on now in relation to Op Sheda, where, of course, we're involved in a counter-terrorist operation, albeit mainly from the air, in northern Iraq and parts of Syria. So, it never goes away because of the types of operations that British troops have involved themselves in for the last 40 or 50 years.
Well, to help us understand the complexities of the law and how it applies to Britain's servicemen and women, we welcome 2 veterans who bring a wide range of experience and legal understanding. The Reverend Nicholas Mercer served in Army legal services for 2 decades, retiring as a Lieutenant Colonel in 2011. His career included being Commander Legal during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Welcome back to Sitrep, Reverend Mercer. Good to see you again.
Thank you very much, Kate.
And also with us is Patrick Hennesey. His 5 years as an army officer included operational tours to Iraq in 2006 and Afghanistan in 2007. After leaving in 2009, he retrained and has been a barrister for 15 years, in which time he's advised and acted for the government. He also co-authored a report protecting those who serve for the Policy Exchange think tank. Good to see you again, Patrick.
Thanks, Kate. Nice to be on.
So I want to draw on your experiences that you both have to understand what legal decisions are made and how on combat operations. And your experiences are from either end of the chain. Nicholas, if we start with you, if we could look at your role in Iraq as Commander Legal, that was at the top of the chain. What kind of decisions would you make?
Well, I have a huge range of decision making. My role as the Commander Legal was really to audit the battlefield. That can be everything from G1 to G5 across the complete spectrum, from prisoners of war given registration by G1, for instance, to use of artillery, to treatment of prisoners of war, to combat operations, and specifically the rules of engagement, which I'd keep my constant sort of attention on to see that they were appropriate for the combat conditions which we found ourselves in. I was there really to say to people if they put a foot into touch. I describe my role really as navigating it, helping a general navigate his way down the mouth of a river. There are sandbanks, legal sandbanks on the way, and he has to navigate his way down that river mouth. I also described it as being like a touch judge. The army can get on with its combat operations, but if they put a foot into touch, it's my duty to raise the red flag and say, we have a problem here. And that's exactly what I did.
And who would be asking you the questions? Who would be asking for your advice?
Well, anyone can come and ask my advice at any time, and they did, from the commander downwards. But also our job was to keep eyes and ears over the battlefield in all its manifestations to make sure people weren't doing things that were unlawful. By way of example, for instance, I wandered into an interrogation facility and found prisoners of war being abused. I immediately raised my objections to the general that night and said, "Sir, this breaches Article 13 of the Third Geneva Convention." And then we took it from there. So that's by way of example.
So when you made your decisions, who would need to know what those decisions were, and how would they actually reach the people that needed to have those decisions and enact them?
Well, I have a direct line to the general, so I would make my concerns known to him. I didn't have to staff it through the DCOS, Chief of Staff, and so on and so forth. I would go direct to the GOC, and then he would take the appropriate action through his Chief of Staff and DCOS, and we'd address it that way. It would also be staffed up to higher headquarters, so it would go to the NCC and PGHQ at the same time.
Patrick, can you explain your roles in Iraq and Afghanistan, how much you were or weren't asked to consider legality as part of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a very privileged position in the sense that I was a platoon and company commander effectively. So on the ground, in charge of troops in Iraq, operating under a quite complex legal framework because by 2006, the combat operations had been declared complete. And in Afghanistan, a slightly more straightforward rules of engagement framework, but the complexity of working in partnership with an Afghan Kandak, a battalion. So I had about 15 sort of slightly more highly trained British soldiers, but we were kind of effectively working in partnership with and sort of directing / mentoring about 300 Afghans. And obviously that brings up its own rules of engagement and legal challenges. But I say I was in a privileged position because actually at my level and my job, I guess, as a junior commander, was relatively straightforward, and I tended to give pretty much the same brief in respect of rules of engagement and legality to all my troops in all the operations we conducted, which was basically, I know you, I've worked with you, I know you know right from wrong. If you stay on the right side, I will support you to the hilt. If you go on the wrong side, I'll be the first to come down on you like a ton of bricks. And I think that's deceptively simple, but at the junior command level, that you can do that. And I think it would help greatly with morale. And I think one of the things that the heavily starred, weighty top brass letter in the Times brought out was the morale issue. I think it's interesting, Michael, you sort of said, and I think it was a slip of the tongue, but you said the operations which the British Army have involved themselves in the last 30 years. And I think the key point is the British Army hasn't involved itself in operations. It has been ordered to conduct operations by the UK government. And I think where there is a feeling of being let down, it is by the disjunct between politicians and, of course, government members. Operational decisions at the cabinet level are not justiciable, but you are asked to conduct operations. You're invariably asked to conduct operations in a very complex legal framework. There will always be a political pressure to pretend a situation is less complex than it is. That's why we called the Troubles, when they were in fact a pretty bloody civil war. That's why they declared the warfighting phase in Iraq in 2003 over, good 4 or 5 years before it was. So you're always going to have that pressure. But I think there are two slightly different but linked lawfare issues that we're currently dealing with. There is a cultural and societal issue whereby we simply, as a society, do not have the same common understanding, kind of moral framework that we had perhaps in the Second World War. And so in the same way that operations that were conducted in the Second World War, and one thinks of strategic bombing campaigns, would be unacceptable today. And so when you think about how much time and effort is put into targeting and the legality of targeting operations, and when I was on the ground in Afghanistan and wanting to call in close air support, very delicate procedures, fortunately all very slickly done. But anecdotally, we would prefer to know that we had American close air support overhead than our own, because you could be more guaranteed that they would drop the ordnance that you wanted, where you wanted it, when you wanted it. That's a cultural thing, and that comes from within. And actually, it's all very well for top brass to complain about that, but actually, they can lead on that as well. The Ministry of Defence can provide that leadership. I think operationally, it is the sort of the people that Nicholas was advising. Brigade commanders need to know that they are going to be protected by the generals above them and empowered to let their troops, like my guys were, to do whatever needs to be done. There's a second type of lawfare, I think, and in a way, this one worries me more, and that is that outside hostile observers, and I don't think it would be controversial to say one has in mind sort of Iranians, Chinese, Russians, looking at how we operate today in this country, cannot fail to see that there is a very effective front that can be opened up to attrit our capability with legal social pressure. And that sort of lawfare, the idea that you're going to be dragged through the courts by somebody posing as a civil activist, but who's actually well funded by somebody who's got slightly more malign interests, that is something that I think is a threat in the future, and that action perhaps does need to be taken to guard against.
Okay. Patrick's exactly right. The relationship between the military and the political class, political elite, is really important in this. And interestingly, General Mike Rose, wrote in the newspapers yesterday about this whole issue, and he mentioned the 1988 operation. Remember Death on the Rock, the 3 IRA terrorists who were killed in Gibraltar? Operation Flavius it was. And he said in the inquiry, that was very controversial at the time, and the inquiry into it, he said that the Ministry of Defence wasn't allowing the release of very important documents which would have testified on behalf of the SAS soldiers. And he said that he got a private meeting with the Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, at the time, and he said to him, if my boys go down for this, you'll be going down with them as well, because you signed the order. And he said after that meeting, all the documents were made available. But the point he was making is that he had to remind a politician that you, the politician, ordered us to do this. You signed the order. You're in the frame if we are. And the eventual outcome was that the SAS were perfectly justified in what they did, because that IRA unit were planning a pretty big bomb attack in Gibraltar.
Can I say something? I'm sorry, but I don't agree with the last two speakers. I think the thrust of this conversation is wrong. The very word lawfare suggests that somehow that lawyers are against the military. They're not. I worked with the military for 20 years, most of my professional life. What we're talking about is accountability of the army. And what happened in my time in the military was that the army, what I called it, came of age. In other words, they didn't get a free pass anymore. I remember Lee Clegg going to prison after he fired those fatal shots and was convicted in 1995. From now on, the army was answerable for every shot fired. And that was just the new age we found ourselves in. If you go back behind that and you look at all the previous colonial campaigns, Cyprus, Malaya, Kenya, the army got a free pass. We committed the most appalling atrocities, and we did in Northern Ireland. The age that's come upon us now is one of accountability, where the army is examined for the actions that it takes. After all, it is a purveyor of lethal force on behalf of the state, and it's quite right that it should be accountable. What's not helpful is this constant attack on the rule of law, as if somehow it's a force for bad. It's not. It's a force for good. And it also assists operational efficacy at the same time. I've given advice in peace support operations, peacekeeping operations, Northern Ireland, and an international armed conflict. And I can't impress upon you more the need for upholding the rule of law and not constantly undermining the narrative.
If it came across that I was criticising the rule of law, absolutely not. And I don't think of the term as lawfare as meaning lawyers against the armed forces. I think lawfare, to my mind, is the use of legal frameworks and legal structures in interacting with operational effectiveness. And as I said, my concern is it's going to be our enemies who use lawfare. I think the reason why lawyers have been demonised is because it is a very convenient get out for politicians. And Nicholas, I could not agree with you more that it is about accountability. And one of the things I have said before, and I will say again, I think in the context of conversations around special forces operatives feeling that they are not being protected, is we have to account for our mistakes. And I am not remotely a person who would argue for some sort of special legal pleading. But I think the problem is this. Within the context of the rule of law, it is open to governments to do more to help the armed forces. So a good example is a lot of the problems that came from the second Iraq conflict were to do with the extraterritorial effect of the European Convention on Human Rights, passed into law in this country by the Human Rights Act. That created a set of frameworks under which investigations had to be conducted, ultimately led to the IHAT, the Iraq Historical Allegations Tribunal. Now, they dealt with, I think, 1,500 odd cases, and painstakingly found absolutely none of them had a case to answer. If in future operations the government committed to derogating, which it is perfectly legally entitled to do, from the extraterritorial applicability of the Human Rights Act, that doesn't weaken in any way the rules under which we operate, but it just supports the military in that way. It's not about changing the law. It's not about undermining the rule of law. It's about supporting our armed forces through the current structures. And I think actually the accountability is also for politicians to sort of not hide behind lawyers and the soldiers who are doing what they ask them to do.
Okay, Nicholas, if we could look at the big picture, not specific cases, where does the legal responsibility lie? Is a private soldier legally responsible if they carry out in good faith an order that they have been given?
Yes, obeying an order is not a defence to a criminal charge. So the soldier is responsible for the action that they take. What I always tried to impress, I wanted every single soldier that we taught and instructed in the rules of engagement to be certain, so that he was sure of the course of action he could take. So we taught rules of engagement, and we tried to make soldiers have the confidence required to take the robust action that they were ordered to do. But it is that everyone's responsible for their own individual actions.
And Patrick, just briefly, was that legal responsibility something that weighed on your mind when you received orders and passed them on and passed on your own?
Yes, because ultimately you're guided by a sort of a moral framework, and you want to do the right thing. I don't think it was something that I had to worry about too much. Again, I was very privileged. I worked with very well-trained soldiers. I had the opportunity of working with them before we deployed on operations. You won't always have that luxury. But I wanted to try and simplify things as much as I possibly could. But within that context, I, as many others did, at some point, sort of 5 years after having left the army, received my letter from the IHAT asking me for come in for a polite chat, have a cup of coffee. You're not in any trouble at all. We just want to know about this or that or the other. And this is where I think we don't help ourselves, because I always get very nervous when I see letters in the papers or newspaper articles complaining that soldiers are being treated like common criminals. If somebody alleges credibly that you have broken the law, that has to be investigated. And we haven't helped ourselves with things like Barhamusa, where it was absolutely appalling what happened, and it should have been identified much more quickly, and the people who perpetrated it should have been punished. But the problem that happens is because we haven't done that effectively, and I'm sure Nicholas can speak to this in far greater detail than I can, you then have a situation where things which frankly are not remotely in the same ballpark are given a huge importance. That is the sort of friction that you have to kind of try and deal with. And so when I briefly had responsibility for a detention facility, which is obviously a kind of very sensitive legal kind of context and sort of particular military task, that was the one time in my entire career where I could see, and I was concerned that the soldiers operating under my command were absolutely terrified of doing the wrong thing, because, for example, when transitioning a detainee from one cell to another, leading them because they were wearing the sort of sensory deprivation stuff, which they had to do, the soldier carrying his box of possessions tripped up, fell flat on his arse, spilled the stuff everywhere, lots of hilarity among the guardsmen, and 2 weeks later was being investigated for abusing this detainee because apparently he'd thrown his possessions on the floor. I mean, that's the sort of thing that we need to be able to say, that's nonsense, so that we can focus on the stuff which isn't nonsense.
I'm sorry, but that really does infantilize the debate, because that's, we had some really appalling corporate systematic abuse of prisoners that we flagged as the Commander Legal. I flagged up the mistreatment of prisoners, and because of the sort of rank indifference to it, that abuse continued. And even when it was debated in Parliament, people like Liam Fox were sort of rather dismissive of the court's judgment. There's this constant pushback against legal requirements, which of course undermines the legal safeguards that have been put in place, quite rightly, under international law, under domestic law, to make sure we conduct ourselves properly on the battlefield. And just throw, Patrick, with all due respect, an anecdote like that's not helpful, saying somehow it's all trivial. The fact is that we raised the issue, and I'm really pleased that your soldiers were taking the issue of proper prison treatment responsibly, because that wasn't the case at the start of Optelic 1. That shows you just how important the law is in making sure. And absolutely, and I think
we definitely benefited from the work that your division and you chaps had done at the outset. And I wasn't trying to infantilize it. I was simply, when we read in the papers that morale is being affected or that troops are worried, that is like, everybody I served with deplored what happened in Barhamusa. But I think it is correct to say that when we try and redress the problems like that, I can't remember, was it Sergeant Blackwell, was the Marine who shot an unarmed Afghan in 2009? Again, I wonder whether that would have come out if it hadn't been for the body cam footage. And I was not one of those who said he should be anything other than punished properly by the law, because if you don't do that, then people acting in the right way can't be protected.
But that example that Nicholas, that you said was infantilizing, I mean, how do you balance, though, his concern, Patrick's concern that he expressed there about trivial cases being treated the same way as serious ones are?
Well, I mean, as I said, there was systematic abuse. What I discovered in Iraq in 2003 was we were employing the 5 techniques on prisoners of war. So the 5 techniques which had been banned by the European Convention on Human Rights in 1978 in the case of Ireland versus the UK had suddenly resurfaced in the intelligence corps. I spotted it, complained, and there was one hell of a battle trying to get it stopped.
On the issue, though, Nicholas, of following orders on the battlefield, for example, what do you do? Where does the soldiers stand legally if they're asked to do something which is illegal? It's an order.
Well, it's no defence, as I've said before. And I turn the whole thing around. It's not to do with the law. It's to do with failure to respect the law. And that goes all the way from politicians through the chain of command downwards. If we had respect and absolutely, we were robust, absolutely rock solid on this about complying with the laws of war, we would not be in this position. It's not the fault of the law, it's the fault of the commanders not taking the law seriously enough.
So I completely agree with Nicholas in that respect. And Kate, to your point about soldiers being asked to do something illegal, part of the brief that I always gave my guardsmen was that they were to, if I gave them an order that was illegal, they were to tell me to get get lost effectively. But I think it's really interesting that the Nicholas referred there to the 5 techniques, kind of resurfacing in Iraq and kind of special forces operations, and I think they links back to the point I made at the start about there's a cultural element. I think Nicholas would agree with me. I take the view that a rather insidious cultural trend kind of emerged with following 9/11 from the United States, and you look at things like Guantanamo, and it informed the invasion of Iraq, and it has permeated, in particular, American Special Forces operatives. Yep. And that is, I would completely agree with Nicholas, it's a disregard for the rule of law. I do wonder, and maybe it's an overly fine distinction, whether those flagrant abuses and the culture of disrespect is in part contributed to by the lack of clarity. We didn't see that so much in previous campaigns where people were operating under a more traditional rules of armed conflict. That's not to justify it, but I do wonder whether there's a linkage to that. But I do think there's a cultural problem there, and I think you're absolutely right to identify that, Nicholas.
Can we just have a little bit of clarity then, Mike? We've got two very fine legal minds here, but can you just give us a layman's guide to the big principle of what is and what isn't legal in war, and who says so?
Well, I mean, the basic principle is that what is illegal in Britain is illegal abroad, and that all soldiers, all service personnel are responsible for themselves, as Nicholas said. Obeying orders is no defence, and that goes back to the Nuremberg principles. To say I was only obeying orders is no defence if you do something that's illegal. The issue then is how much latitude is there within the laws of armed conflict, and when does an operation qualify to be an armed conflict? And again, what the military are looking for is clear political guidance, so that we say this is an armed conflict within the meaning of the term, and that means that these things are this is legal and this isn't. But in general, it's the same principles of domestic law apply abroad. And that's the fundamental problem. Operating abroad in a conflictual situation, it's very hard to apply those things in a split second on the ground, or to these issues of interrogation. You can see these 5 techniques that we talk about. I mean, you know what soldiers are thinking about. I mean, they think if they've got somebody in there, they want information. They're not trying to interrogate these characters for long-term stuff. They want something immediate. Who else is out there? Are they planting bombs? Where are they putting them? They want to make them uncomfortable and frightened, so they tell them things in the first few hours, and that's where the mistreatment tends to arise.
The 5 techniques point is actually a really useful one, I think, because I think there's a distinction to be drawn between when soldiers conduct military operations using tactics or in a way that is of itself illegal or has been kind of has been ruled to be so. So the 5 techniques, as Nicholas said, had been discredited and they weren't supposed to be being practiced, and it was sort of an unfortunate thing that somehow they came back in. I think it was through the intelligence corps. So there is when you are carrying out your job in a way that has been deemed to be improper or potentially illegal, but then there is also when you carry out your job exactly as you've been told to do, in the way that you're told to do it, and you're still subject to legal challenge. And I think that is what kind of the morale side complaint from the generals goes to. And that's what, the 99% of people who are investigated by IHAP would say is not, I did something wrong and I'm being investigated, but I did exactly what I was told to do and I'm being investigated. And you can't stop those investigations. Again, I'm not trying to especially plead for military operations. If somebody makes a complaint, it has to be investigated. But I do feel that there must be ways in which we could make our armed forces feel that they will be better supported if they haven't broken the rules.
Just add a counter. I agree with you that they obviously the 5 techniques had somehow reappeared on the battlefield in Iraq, and how that happened, I do not know. No one. We never got to the bottom of that. But you get something like Sergeant Blackburn. He's got a camera on his helmet, and he uses the word "shuffle off this mortal coil, you bleep bleep bleep." Boys, I've just broken the Geneva Conventions. What that demonstrates is contempt for the rule of law. Caught on video cam. How did we get to this point? We got to this point because there's such contempt and attack on the rule of law. Professor Una MacDonald who's just been appointed head of international law at Yale University, has pointed to the fact that the international legal framework is in danger of collapse. And you're seeing manifestations of this in the British Army. And quite frankly, the General's letter, in my view, is not helpful at all, because it just feeds into this right-wing narrative that somehow the law is attacking our soldiers. It's not. We operate within a rule of law, within the international legal framework. And if you don't uphold that, this is what happens. We descend into barbarity. And as a commander legal, I was really strict about this. It's there for a good reason.
So one quick thing on that Al Blackman's video cam, Nicholas. In a sense, it's even worse than you said. I mean, we can think what we do about Al Blackman and the strain he was under at the time, but that video cam footage was circulated as a bit of entertainment around other Royal Marines, and it came to light because somebody down the line said this is wrong, but a lot of other people saw it and thought it was good fun to watch. So the fact that his video cam was shared, that actually is, in a sense, adds to your point that there was something in the culture at that stage of the Marines that they thought this was okay.
So that letter from 8 generals and 1 Air Chief Marshal that I mentioned and we were talking about, they raised the Human Rights Act, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. They're not the only ones to raise concerns about it. Indeed, Patrick mentioned it earlier. Nicholas, you pointed out in your own letter to the Times newspaper that you were the first lawyer to have to consider the implications of this act on overseas operations, and you don't share their concerns. Did it have any impact on your thinking?
Well, first of all, I came into the Iraq War hot off the back of the Bankovic case, which I watched in part in Strasbourg, which was the first case really to put its foot into this arena of extraterritorial jurisdiction for the European Convention on Human Rights. So we were finding our way tentatively, and that has only emerged over time. What was clear to me was it didn't affect the commander on the battlefield because we don't have jurisdiction on the battlefield. Therefore, it's not triggered. Therefore, it did not fetter a commander's ability to take the fight to the enemy. Myth number one. It's constantly put around that's the position. The only time it came into play was when people were in the custody of the state, in other words, prisoners of war, and therefore how we should be treating them, both in terms of the prisoner of war camp and during interrogation. Hence the reason the 5 techniques fell foul, in my view, not only of Article 13 of the Third Geneva Convention, but also Article 3 of the Convention on Human Rights. And I would say it's really useful having the Convention on Human Rights there because it acts as a backstop. Because people, we have had attempts by the previous government to try and get out of some of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions. So we have this backstop that sort of reinforces the whole thing. And the same applies in Northern Ireland. It is referred to in the Belfast Agreement as a safeguard, and it is.
Patrick, the report you co-authored for Policy Exchange argues the Act needs updating. Why?
Well, I like Nicholas. I'm not one of these people who thinks that it's a problem. I think Bankovic and the extraterritorial applicability is interesting, and the sort of the additional nuance that I would add to the points that Nicholas correctly makes is part of the problem arises, as we discussed earlier, when politicians in their haste to clear up the mess they've probably created want to declare a combat phase over. And the issue with extraterritorial applicability, and Nicholas referred to it, is it only comes in when somebody is in your custody, which is all very well if you are the Metropolitan Police and you're taking someone into custody and you're putting them in the back of a van in Soho on a Friday night. But when you're dealing with, as 20 Brigade had in 2006, for example, when a helicopter went down in Basra and then there was a huge riot scenario, the lines between custody and not custody are incredibly blurred. You might have a company of infantry soldiers facing a crowd of 600 people. Somebody is throwing a petrol bomb. They're kind of wrestled to the ground by 2 soldiers who then have to turn around and start giving someone first aid. Has that person been brought into your custody now, or are they still actually a rioter? This is the sort of the friction that happens at the crunchy point. And I think the main point that we made in the report, and I think it is a point that supporters of the Act and supporters of the Convention, like myself, need to sort of trumpet more loudly for fear of actually leading to a worse outcome where the voices that want to get rid of it entirely win, is to say, look, use the structures in place, derogate from the extraterritorial applicability provisions when you go into operations, then some of these issues won't arise. The thing that that caused a lot of additional work to be done and caused a lot of headaches, ultimately, I think, unnecessarily, was the requirement under the Act and under the Convention for independent investigations into incidents. So a lot of investigations, which actually, when you look at the nuts and bolts of them, were perfectly properly undertaken and came to absolutely the right conclusion. But because they were undertaken by the Royal Military Police, they didn't count as independent. That's the sort of thing that the thrust, the protections that the Act gives are universally obviously good. And what they stand for is something that we as a country should stand for and deploy our armed forces around the world in support of. And we shouldn't get lost in the difficulties of application.
But Mike, are our forces fighting, though, with one hand tied effectively behind their back because they're facing stricter laws than our enemies?
Well, they're certainly facing stricter laws than most of our opponents. But I mean, I think there's a lot of opinion that they know the law is no real bar to the things that they need to do on operations. The problem is they think it is. That our forces think that they're under greater constraint. And that's partly because of, news from, the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which, just went on and on and on, and cases like, which you've mentioned, the Bahamousa case in Iraq and the al-Swedi case also in Iraq. These things, these inquiries, which go on for years, and the IHAT thing, which is the historical investigations of, 2,000 cases, all of those sorts of things keep alive in the minds of our service personnel that they are under constant legal scrutiny, which indeed they are, but objectively it's no greater now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but they think it is.
Yeah, and that is an interesting point that Mike makes there, people thinking that they're under stricter laws. So if we come back to the central question, how do we give soldiers, sailors and aviators confidence that they will be backed for doing their job correctly? In their letter this week, the retired senior officers conclude by saying the government needs to restore legal clarity with a new, honest framework. So some broad potential solutions to talk about. Do we need to change the law? Could we argue the current law is in the right place, but everybody, politicians, judges, down to private soldiers, need to understand it better? Or what about the idea that legal responsibility needs to sit higher up, even at a corporate MOD level? Patrick?
Yeah, I don't think we need to change the law, and as I said, I'm wary of those voices that call for repealing the Human Rights Act or kind of coming away from the European Convention. I think they're cornerstones of who we are and what we stand for. Corporate responsibility at the Ministry of Defence is an interesting one. I remember they're dealing with one of the cases that arose out of a blue-on-blue incident in the early phase of the Iraq conflict, where very tragically one of our Challenger 2 tanks shot on another one. Obviously a kind of tragic incident, and there were legal claims brought by the families of the soldiers who died in that incident. And one of the things that was frustrating and I think confusing was that the troop commander of the tank in question was potentially subject to legal proceedings to see whether he acted properly or improperly in ordering the initial shot to be taken, which actually is a paradigm example of a battlefield decision that wouldn't normally be justiciable. It was in the very early phase of the war, but you couldn't challenge, legally anyway, procurement decisions taken at a ministerial level. And one of the things the families are saying is if a certain type of blue-on-blue tracking kit had been fitted, maybe this wouldn't have happened. So I do think, if you're talking about morale, I do think it's difficult for junior commanders to see their colleagues, corporals, getting dragged through the courts, while the politicians who order them there are immune from the decisions they take. So I don't know what the solution to that is, but I do think it presents a sort of a difficulty.
So Nicholas, your solutions then: change the law, understand the law better, make it corporately responsible by the MOD. What do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, the law's broadly right and in place, including human rights. I think that's absolutely the first thing to state. My answer to you is stop undermining the law. It's a constant, non-stop attack on lawyers, lawfare, and everything goes with it. If we're not careful, we will collapse the very system that we've put in place to ensure that people conduct themselves properly on the battlefield. I would also say this: General Nick Parker said in his letter, confidence in command is the foundation of security. Well, I would answer to that. There's been a catastrophic failure of command that allowed such barbarity and such flagrant breaches of the laws of war to take place, in a British uniform. I think it's brought absolute disgrace on this country, and I'm not surprised that people are leaving the special forces, because the moral injury that many of those soldiers have suffered will have caused them to lose faith in the chain of command and the British Army.
Okay, I want to get a final thought from each of you now. What would you say to someone nervous about the idea of serving their country because it could land them in court and even in prison for doing what they thought was the right thing? Patrick?
I would say what I said to my troops when we were about to deploy out on an operation. If you know the difference between right and wrong, you can be confident that you will be protected as long as you don't cross that boundary. And it would break my heart to think that somebody was not going to join the armed forces or was going to leave the armed forces because they thought that was an issue. It's a moral component, and we teach that, and we should try and uphold it. And as Nicholas said, there have been serious failings, and those are failings of command. But I do think that the corollary to Nick's point about stopping the attacks on lawyers, stopping the undermining the rule of law, is those articles equally feed into the undermining the confidence of soldiers. So the clarity would be welcome, not just in the sense that it would stop these attacks, as it were, on lawyers and attacks that undermine the rule of law. It would also give confidence to that hypothetical young guardsman who's thinking, oh gosh, am I going to end up getting sued for doing my job?
And Nicholas, what would you say to someone nervous about the idea of serving their country?
Well, I've got a son in the army who's just finished Sandhurst, and I've got a son in the Metropolitan Police who's just finished his police training. And I've taken a keen interest in their training throughout, particularly the legal aspect. And it seems to be pretty solid and sound to me. So I'm quite impressed with that. So it's about solid training. Don't worry, you will be trained properly and effectively, and you will know where that boundary lies.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about law and accountability, it doesn't sit in any one place. It sits everywhere, from the bottom to the top, from the private soldier or service personnel right up to the commanders and the politicians who send them on operations. That's the whole point. It sits everywhere. And again, I mentioned General Mike Rose's article yesterday, which I thought was very interesting. Somebody else he revealed in that article that he was commander of 2-2 SAS during the Iranian embassy siege in 1980. And he said that, well, it's not what he said in the article, but we know that Mrs. Thatcher, Prime Minister, she'd not been Prime Minister for very long. And at that stage, in May 1980, she was very, very unpopular. But she gave a very clear political direction. She said that those people who are in the embassy, they either submit to arrest or you kill them. They die. They're not going to leave. That's the whole point. They're either arrested or they die. And that's my direction. She gave it to William Whitelaw, Deputy Prime Minister, to run the operation. Now, he was a decorated soldier from, I think, the armoured forces in the Second World War. He had a military cross. He also conveyed, this is according to Mike Rose, he said he conveyed to Mike Rose himself as commander of 2-2 SAS, the Prime Minister says, if you have to go into the embassy, as they did, if this operation turns into a fiasco, I, the Prime Minister, will take full responsibility. And of course, it nearly did become a fiasco. It looked at the time like a textbook operation, but we now know it wasn't. It nearly went wrong in all sorts of ways. But she said, if this is a fiasco, I will take responsibility. And according to Mike Rose, that was a really important statement for his people to know about before they undertook that operation in May 1980, breaking into the embassy through the windows and abseiling back down the back end, the back lane of the thing. All the things that they did was an astonishing operation, but they had the confidence that they were taking big risks with complete political authority as to what they had to do and political accountability if it went wrong.
Thank you. That's a really interesting thought to end on. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the Reverend Nicholas Mercer and Patrick Hennesey. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can stay up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.